Bliss and Grit is an entirely listener-supported show. Supporting us is also designed to support you through keeping the episodes rolling, but also through rewards for your donation, like a Getting Started guide, a private forum, and downloadable meditations. To become a supporting member, you can visit patreon.com/bliss and grit.
Hello, beautifuls. You're listening to Bliss and Grit. I'm Vanessa Scotto, and I'll be joined soon by my dear friend and my co-host, Brooke Thomas. On the show, we're having conversations about the awakening spiritual path, and what does that even mean? What is a real evolution of our lives? How do we ultimately embrace everything? The beauty and the crazy, the joys and the messes, the bliss and the grit that is a human life. Today, we're speaking about the difference between intellectual knowing and a lived, felt experience of wisdom when it comes to healing. I think we've all seen firsthand that knowing something often isn't enough to create a transformation in our lives. For example, you can know that you shouldn't be so hard on yourself, yet you may still continue to criticize yourself relentlessly. This conversation we're having may seem simple at first, but in exploring our own path of embodied transformation, we wind up taking a few interesting twists and turns through topics like intergenerational trauma, how to be forgiveness, and how to find existence in your own body. If you're enjoying the show, we would love your support. It's super helpful to us if you leave a review on iTunes. It helps more people find the show, and it just feels great to us to read. You can also head over to blissandgrit.com and subscribe to receive our blog and weekly digest, or find out more about becoming one of our precious supporting members on Patreon. We've made a decision not to have advertisers on the show, so becoming a patron is the way to help us continue to provide these episodes that we hope uplift your world. If you've been benefiting from the show, we appreciate if you pop on over to Patreon and make a donation and get some rewards for your support. Side note, Brooke and I also do see clients privately for coaching, so feel free to go to the website, blissandgrit.com, and get more information on that. One last thing, in case you're new to the show, from time to time, Brooke and I do curse, and so if you're in mixed, non-swearing company, feel free to pop in some headphones right now. Okay, everyone, here we go. Hello, Brooke.
Hey, Vanessa.
And hello, beautiful listeners. So, Brooke, I'm going to throw you a little curveball.
Great.
Because we knew I was going to begin, but we didn't know what I was going to begin with. And I just remembered I had this beautiful quote I wanted to share.
Yay, I love it.
I know, I love starting with quotes. I've always been a dork like that. Like, I've been collecting quotes just in case I wrote a book, I think since I was like 16. So let's just see how fun this quote really is. And it touches on what I want to talk about, so I'll expand further after. But it is from our friend, John Prendergast.
Love him.
Yeah, we do love him. And it's nice to bring his voice back into our conversation because I don't think, our interview with John must have been...
It was a while ago.
I don't know, over a year ago, right? Okay. So John says, this brings us to the issue of trusting life no matter what. Some call this trust faith, but faith usually means believing in something. Trust is not based on a belief. Rather, it is a felt sense of being held by a benevolent presence or field that is greater than the little me. Don't you just love that quote?
I love that. It's so good. And it brings in a deeper dimension of what we were kind of sketching out before we started recording.
Yeah, it really does. And, first of all, we could have a whole conversation, of course, on trusting life and on being held by a benevolent presence or a field that's greater than us, and why that's so important in things like healing and trauma recovery and in frankly just realizing your true nature. But part of what I wanted to bring our attention to is just the concept of differentiating between knowing on a cognitive or intellectual level and experiencing, being, embodying a teaching or a wisdom. And people put a lot of different language to that. Sometimes they'll call embodied knowing wisdom, and they'll call intellectual knowing something else. And so there's all different ways that people can discuss this. But I don't know, the other day I was sitting and talking to a friend, and they were just kind of sketching something out for me that they were going through, how they were, I suppose, having a healing session, but watching the healing session as it happened, as if like they're taking notes on it, and then they're trying to direct it a little bit, and they're, it's like as if they're gaming the system somehow, like they're participating. Which reminded me of times in my life where here I am receiving energy work and I'm laid back on the table and I am trying to help the energy worker with my mind and my field of experience, which, in a way, please, this is all innocent and very sweet. But in a way, if we look at it from another perspective, we could understand that there is a difficulty or a fear or a pattern of resistance to just letting go and surrendering into beingness, right? I remember when we were at our meditation retreat, when you and I did meditating with the body, and Tammy Simon was our teacher. And I've told this story before, but it just feels relevant. Excuse me. And we were 4 days deep into a 5-day meditation retreat or something. And Tammy said, see if you can even let go of the observing one. See if you can even be, and I don't think she used this language, but like so surrendered into the moment, so present, so in the moment that you even let go of the observing one. And then she went on to make a joke, the one that's writing a HuffPo article so you could tell all your friends about meditation, which, hello, I do all the time. I'm always trying to track my experience so I can share it later. It's been recent that I've been able to do differently than that. But there is something interesting. Adyashanti points to this too sometimes when he teaches his true meditation, like, can you even let go of the observing one? Which is really like counter to how we may think of things at some point, right? There's always the awareness watching. But I thought, I know this is sort of a really vague place to start this conversation on the difference between intellectual knowing and experiencing. But here's where I'm starting. Is, I guess, at the point where how can we meet and have a lived experience rather than a separate analysis and intellectualization of ourselves, of the world, and of the spiritual path?
Yeah, and I think just to sketch out like why, there's many reasons why this is close to our hearts, but one of the reasons why this is really useful to ponder for all of us on a path is because it's the only place where things actually change, is if you can have a lived, felt experience of something. And so if we take it outside of the realm of the spiritual path, like let go of the observer one, like don't, all that kind of just be with your beingness, all those phrases that we've all heard a million times. They're like, what do you mean? If it's something like, this is a cliche example, but it's very helpful. If it's something like learning to ride a bike, I can read every book about bikes. I can learn about repairing bikes. I can learn about all of the parts. I can read someone's memoir about riding from the East Coast to the West Coast. And I can really have an understanding of everything about bikes and cycling culture and all of that stuff. But I can still get on a bike and not know how to ride a bike if I haven't actually taken the time to have the experience of how does this go? And the way that we discover embodied experience is that kind of really basic, how does it go? Like, oh, I thought it was going to feel like this, but it feels like this. And like, wow, I really suck at this. And oh, if I go too fast and I turn too fast, it falls over and I don't know how to put my foot down with the right timing. And like, oh, and you like tinker and you figure it out. But it's all, which isn't to say that I'm not trying to draw an example of it's going to be confusing and clunky and hard, because that's another storyline that we have. But just that the sort of micro adaptation, adjustment, that learning through fluid doing, being, experiencing is really different than cognitive knowledge. And one of the things that really attracted me to Dharma Ocean, which is where this whole party got started for us in many ways. I mean, it got started with being born, but the thing that really ramped it up.
Kicked it up.
Right, exactly. They call themselves the practicing lineage, and they're very clear about, and Reggie Ray is very clear about, things don't change from understanding. Things don't change. You can read every Buddhist text. You can read every, 4,000 page book that Reggie Ray wrote. You can. He started out as an intellectual, still is an intellectual. But it doesn't matter. Practice changes things. Practice makes the difference. And it's not so that you can go, because the cognitive way of understanding practice is like you're going to log the hours, right? You'll log your miles, like filling in your chore chart when you were a kid growing up. But that's not the point either. The point isn't, because that's a cognitive understanding. I am the one who has done, 40 hours of meditation this year or whatever. Doesn't matter. What was the quality of the experience? What did you get from that? Did you discover, just like when you're tinkering and figuring out how to learn how to ride a bike, did you discover like, well, first I sit down and I notice how shitty my body feels. Interesting. And then I go crazy with my brain talking to me. And then I judge myself for my thoughts. And then I'm trying to remember if I'm supposed to drop my thoughts. And then I blah, 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 blah. Oh, and then there was this moment where things opened up and it felt like there was all this honey in my body. And I just felt like my breath was this exquisite fluid movement. And then my mind noticed me noticing it, and it said, ooh, look, something's happening. And then it all collapsed. And like, that's lived, embodied knowing of something is like it's how we actually change. It's how we actually move through these things.
Yeah, seems to be required, much to right. The chagrin of my intellectual mind. The thing is, there's something very beautiful about our intellectual minds, right? Mm-hmm. And there's zero problem with learning and intellectualization. I mean, it's fun. It's like fun for the brain. It's just important to notice that intellectual understanding falls short of creating transformation. That unless something is received in your being as an insight, as what we can call an aha, things like that, nothing creates shift. So I remember when I went to grad school for psychology, and you get a lot of really good theories, right? Theories about child development, theories about how healing happens, theories about how the human psyche can become stuck in patterns of pain, right? So great theories. And I studied them all. And I used to do diagrams, and this leads to this, and lots of arrows and pointing. And then under the arrows, steps and everything. And to some extent, I feel like none of it prepared me for the experience of what healing's really like. I feel like none of it prepared me for what realization is like and transformation is like. It's really funny. I mean, I'm sure that's an over-exaggerated statement, but it's like you said, like no one can describe and prepare you for what riding a bike is really like when you feel the wind on your face, or having a baby. I mean, that's got to be a good example. I don't have a baby, but I feel like when I hear women talk about the transition into motherhood, it's like they're in a completely new territory. It doesn't matter how many mothers they've known. It doesn't matter that they were a child at one point and they had a mother. It's still completely unknown because the intellectual relationship to it can't give you a hint of what it's actually going to be like. And I think why I think this topic is important, it's like you said, Brooke, it's because nothing changes if not, and we can see that. But also because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, because it is the ego mind's habit. And sometimes I wish my language was a little more particular, but just the way I use like ego structure, it's like the part of the brain that is the survival system that holds patterns and predicts those patterns into the future and is always trying to strategize for your life. That part of the brain, that ego, the ego always thinks, if I can understand this, I can basically put it into a box and then I can live by these rules. Right. And I was just talking with a client today, and her and I were talking about how, there's a difference between, let's say, the idea you should drink 8 glasses of water a day and am I thirsty? Mastery is, what does my body need? Right? Not some regulation. So the ego wants to put it into a box. Here's how I will get from A to B. Here's what it'll look like. But because the ego can't truly understand, and because often it is the source of the very suffering we are aiming to transform, it falls short of being able to embody the energy, the frequency, and the voice of genuine guidance. So I guess what I mean is, for example, the ego mind is always trying to take our temperature as we're on this like healing, evolving spiritual path. How am I doing? Am I doing well? Am I spiritual enough? Am I good enough? But it has a misunderstanding about the parameters that would determine if one's doing well, because it only has an intellectual, at best, understanding. At worst, a completely, erroneous, trauma-filled understanding of what being a human and realizing your true nature really looks like. So then you do the check-in. How am I doing? Am I doing okay? How's everything working out? I've been trying to do that forgiveness practice. How's that going, right? And then your ego makes a judgment on how you're doing based on zero understanding whatsoever of what actually should be happening. So then you don't shift into the consciousness and the frequency that invites healing, but rather you can get stuck in the mentalization and the objectification that is the hallmark of the ego that is saying, oops, you've fallen short again, which PS is what you've been suffering with, the delusion that you're always falling short.
Right. It compounds. It's like compounding interest on that. Yeah. 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 I mean, I think what you're sketching out is so critical because it's the blind leading the blind, right? If what we're talking about when we talk about the awakening path is transitioning into a consistent experience, ultimately, let's say, of living life from the soul's perspective. And then if all that we have until we glimpse what that feels like is our ego navigator, our ego GPS for life, it's exactly the thing that cannot take us to there. And so it will come up with ever more complex theories or understandings or observations or plans, but it's what can't experience. And as I'm saying this, like, it occurs to me, because when an ego hears this, and let's just like make this less pressurized, right? Most of us, and one of the reasons why this is so challenging and so rare is that we're in an ego-identified culture, and most of us our ego identified. I think the tides are changing. I really believe we're all a part of that, and I'm thrilled. But we don't need to make it that we're like, because only the ego is the one that's like, you're not there yet. Oh, like you are all caught up in your intellectualizing of your healing process theories and whatever. So like we can just destigmatize that a little bit and say like, yeah, that's for most of us at this particular time in human history, that's the state of things. So then the question becomes, so that it's not just dog chasing its tail kind of momentum of like, what am I doing wrong? You're doing it wrong. What am I doing wrong? You're doing it. What, if we want to get a little closer to sketching out what it feels like, this is getting a little meta, to feel, to have an experience. Because I have found it helpful, like you said, your master's degree in counseling and psychology gave you a lot of really interesting, very helpful information, but it actually didn't prepare you for real transformation. And I've found that to be true too. Like all of my understanding about my complex, seemingly to me, it's not that complex, psychological history and personality structure and lineage and blah, blah, it didn't give me any preparation for what true transformation felt like.
Yeah, it's like it's context can be helpful. It's not to downplay that all that wisdom and knowledge, like as if it has no role, right? But it just doesn't prepare you for what the actual experience is like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're dancing around something that's a little tough because there are a lot of teachers out there that are trying to describe what is the experience like, right? And I don't want to just like, what is the experience of awakening like that kind of big exclamation point thing. But what it has felt like to me as I go through this process, starting with Dharma Ocean and really committing to a somatic meditation practice, coming out of a very mental Vipassana meditation practice that felt like prison to me, the way that I applied it to myself. It feels like I change, epiphanies come in, things shift, when there's something akin to, and you pointed at this in the beginning of the episode, like ease. There's a softening. It's the opposite of grasping. And this is where like we're getting into some of the spiritual words we hear all the time.
Surrender,
open hand, and as words, those are like, what? But the experience of it, it's kind of like, well, what does it feel like when you get in a perfectly warm bath on a very chilly day where you've been kind of huddled against the cold all day? It feels like, yeah, yes, ooh. Like there's something in you that just moves automatically towards it.
I think the fact that it feels, period, could be highlighted, because even if you are having an experience, let's say, of the pain that a situation caused you, right? But you're experiencing the pain. You're not mentalizing the pain.
Yeah.
And even if that felt uncomfortable or, agonizing, the experience of feeling it and going through it begins with just the first part of your statement. And I know you're going to go on and you're going to talk about ease, but just that you're feeling, right? If you're not feeling it in your body, it's already probably has a quality of mentalization.
Yeah. And for what that's worth, like to sketch out a little bit, for me, Dark Night of the Soul was what it sounds like. It was unpleasant, and it was a lot of feeling really terrible sensations in my body. And I think in my case, this isn't what's going to happen for everyone, but there was, I had a few profound realizations, and so I couldn't mentalize things the way I used to. I couldn't put things back in the box that I had always used. And so what I was left with was actually feeling what had always been there, sensations that people who are trauma survivors would feel, overwhelm, terror, anxiety, not wanting to be here, all that kind of stuff. But because I couldn't talk my way out of it or talk my way into an interesting corner, like, oh, yes, here's what's happening, and this is in this theory, blah, blah, blah. All I was able to do was to feel it in a very intimate way. And even though I had had ups and downs, of course, my whole life and had been devastated and in despair before, this was really just like, there's no conceptual filter left for you anymore. And so you're going to just feel this. And that actually was the transformative thing, right? Because feeling it, there is a way, and we've talked about this in other episodes, where the limbic loop can get involved and you can it can be overemphasized, right? But there's also just like, it's so basic. This is why words are so hard. It's like, I feel terrified. It's like, okay. And it feels awful. It doesn't feel good, but it's like the atmosphere burning off or something. The fact that I felt it was because it was processing through. I wasn't sweeping it under any carpet anymore, which I had done unconsciously and in innocence and was a great survival strategy at a certain point. But the experience of the conceptual filters going away and only being able to feel meant that I actually got to catch up with the present tense. It was almost like being in freeze, and the thaw means that stuff starts to move. And the movement is that things are actually changing.
Did I think I texted you about this, but did I tell you about what I heard Thomas Hübl say about intergenerational trauma and energy?
I don't think so.
So we'll put this on the website in the resources. It was an episode of Buddha at the Gas Pump, a second episode where Thomas Hübl, who's a wonderful teacher, we're just getting to know him, but we saw him at the Science and Non-Duality Conference and really resonated with his vibe. He was talking about intergenerational trauma. That's really what he does. He works with collective trauma and intergenerational trauma. It's quite a bit of his work. So he's got a really interesting voice, and he calls himself a mystic. So I don't know too much about his background, but he seems to be in both camps of mystic and non-dualism. So he was talking about intergenerational trauma, and the way that he spoke about it was that it's very similar to Reggie Ray and karma. It was basically that if something is too big or too overwhelming for someone to meet it, right? And meet it means kind of what you were talking about, Brooke, just
that it can be
present with it. Yeah. Because there's something about bringing the silence to the pain, right? The silence that you are, the silence that's always there. It's about bringing your unchanging nature to this changing experience of emotion, right? It's something about when the pain can be held in the stillness and presence of you, whoever you are, that it can begin to be integrated and the energy can go and flow again, right? It's not frozen into our DNA or cells or brain or wherever it's stuck, right? Wherever that really is. So he was talking about when it can't be met by somebody and metabolized, that it's almost like how energy can neither be created nor destroyed, like it will just get passed down to the next generation. And if they can't meet it, it will be passed down to the next generation and so on and so forth. The other thing I thought was interesting about it is he was saying, because Rick Archer was saying, well, even though times are kind of tough right now, on some level, it seems like, we probably have it easier than a lot of generations in the past. Yet people seem to be processing so much trauma. And Thomas said that from his perspective, that he thinks what happens is that when things get really good, that's when someone finally has the capacity to meet all of that unmetabolized energy and pain that has come down through the lineage.
Interesting.
Just a really interesting thing to reflect on, right? And so when we start to talk about experience, you can't intellectually solve the problem of the trauma in your family lineage. You can't. You can put it into context. One thing I do think can help experience is context. So let's say we're talking about self-love or self-compassion. you can't intellectually get yourself to have an experience of love. So you can't intellectually get yourself to love yourself. And you can't intellectually experience compassion. Compassion is a felt, embodied experience, right? So what you could do, though, is you could provide the context for understanding to dawn. And sometimes when understanding dawns, the experience of love or compassion are behind it. So let's say, oh, Vanessa, you struggle with, I'm going to make this up, like being nervous to go out in crowds and speak in front of people. Well, let's say in my lineage, someone in my family got shot for speaking out against, something in the culture. Understanding that, understanding where I came from, what I'm related to, like understanding the conditions that this body was baked in and was influenced by. The more understanding I get, which is a bit of an intellectual activity, we could call it that, because it's a perspective. What happens is the more an actual experience of love can come through and compassion can come through. And I've seen this with clients and I've seen it in myself, because if you don't apply that level of understanding, oftentimes you're left with, but why the frick can't I just talk in public? What's my problem?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, it kind of puts at ease the seeking nature of the mind trying to figure out, but why? What's wrong with me? What's wrong with the world?
Yeah, what's wrong with me?
Yeah, it kind of settles that, so that, kind of like you were describing with Thomas Hübl, like something else, that restfulness in the system of context allows for something else to emerge, whether it's
something else can
tenderness
come through
towards the self or healing.
Yeah, it's like our favorite Loch Kelly question, like, what would be here if there was no problem to solve? Like, who would you be if there was no problem to solve? It's almost like when you can get the ego seeking mechanism that's trying to understand it, analyze it, put it into the box and write its strategy up, right? When you can get that to relax, which sometimes the right perspective and understanding can bring, like a surrender of that, then what's really there can come through, right? Your soul, your silence, the one who's unchanging can start to come through. And then we can start to experience something like compassion or forgiveness. Like, I forgot I wanted to mention this. One of our listeners, based on our last week episode where we were talking about judgment and forgiveness, said something to the effect of like, I want to forgive, I don't know how to.
Yeah.
Totally. Of course not, because there is no intellectual process for forgiveness.
Right. That's one of those ones that's like, you can't just say they're forgiven, because you will feel in yourself if that's not true. Or I forgive myself. You'll feel in yourself if that's not true.
That's right. And the feeling, the experience trumps the thought. And that thought alone doesn't seem to shift the belief systems. Mm-hmm. Right? It doesn't seem to shift the fabric of that blueprint that's driving you. So I could say, oh, I forgive so-and-so for hurting me. But if my blueprint says, it's not safe to be around this person, then every time I see them, my nervous system is still going to go off.
Yeah. I
can't intellectualize around that. Mm-hmm. And I think the rich part, the alive part, but the mysterious part is then how do we, right? And, we can maybe talk a little more about that. There's many ways in, but it's like, right, I don't know. First, for me, I have to have an experience that helps me really, really see that blueprint. Mm-hmm. Like really see it. Oh, that's how the pattern's working. And then I need some understanding about like, how did all the players get like this, including me, right? Because usually our wounds are formed in relationship. Like, what happened? And then miraculously, as I make that space, I experience some compassion I never had for myself. And maybe there's some love, maybe even some understanding where forgiveness for the other person arises, right? Mm-hmm. And as all of that's happening in this new level of consciousness, a new perspective is gained and a new frequency is gained. And then something can shift in that blueprint. And when something can shift in that blueprint, now an actual experience has occurred. And now what I notice is when there's been an actual experiential shift, you will think a little different. You will respond a little different. You will behave a little different, and you will feel a little different in circumstances you used to habitually react to in a specific way. So if it's forgiveness, then when I see that person, all of a sudden I may notice I'm not triggered by them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Or all of a sudden I may notice they say something annoying, but the thought that pops up in my head is, boy, may they find peace. And I'll go, oh my God, something really shifted, right? Something was experienced, and experience creates a new perspective, a new frequency, a new level of consciousness gained, more access to ourselves. That's why it creates the transformation in our life. Intellectualization doesn't change the consciousness.
Yeah.
It is the consciousness trying, it's like the energy trying to recreate itself, the part that is stuck or frozen in a certain belief and a certain memory and in the past, trying to solve itself with the same level of energy that was stuck and frozen in the past.
Mm-hmm. And we're experiencing something, many things, all the time. So this isn't, because the ego will think, oh, okay, now what I need to acquire are experiences that feel like epiphanies or whatever. But we're having experiences all the time. So I would say that one of the first steps to this to bring in is honesty with yourself, right? So in the example you gave where there's somebody that's very triggering and you want to forgive, but you don't know how, an honesty step would be something like, I'm furious with them. I'm thinking about them all the time and I'm consumed by rage and I don't want to be, right? Like, that's just honest. That already provides some relief, because the opposite of honesty can look like many things, but one example might be, jumping way too fast to what you know it should look like. So Halloween costume wearing of like, I bless them and forgive them. And underneath what you feel is blind rage towards them, right? So that traps your energy and it traps your ability to have a genuine experience, because you're turning away from your truth right off the bat by faking an experience. You can't fake an experience. It's a concept, right? It's as soon as you're faking an experience, you're shellacking yourself with a concept, and that binds energy and doesn't feel good. And that's where we just get more and more compressed internally. So honesty is a great beginning, because there's something we're experiencing in any given moment, right? And if it's like, God, I just feel anxious all the time. Or I really like, on the opposite end of the spectrum, turning my attention to pleasant experience, which isn't faking. Like if I was feeling enraged in a moment, what I'd be thinking is, wow, I really feel enraged. But let's say in this moment where I'm talking with you, I'm recording an episode, it's quite lovely. I can notice that I'm experiencing how nice the table feels under my hands and how fun it is to do this. Like just noting the truth of the experience. So we're experiencing all kinds of things at any given moment, and we can be honest about what it is. And that's already an invitation of tenderness towards the self, because it's saying, I'm willing to hear. I'm willing to note what's actually going on with you in any given moment. This is talking to the self, right? But like, not with you, Vanessa, as we communicate with ourselves. And that can begin to soften things towards an experience. So I had something recently, and I love when this happens, when you and I record an episode on something, and then I have an experience of doing something that's the opposite of what we talked about. Because it's just such great... This is
why it's so experiential.
Humble pie, right? Like, it's not that we ever, like, stick the landing of human Olympics. Like, I'm the bestest human ever. So judgment was arising. Not in a terrible way, but I was just really noticing judgment towards a friend. And then I note the internal stuff that I pointed out in the last episode, like kind of therapizing them, giving advice in my head. What's great is that the honesty that's been laid down in my system, like tracks, you know, it allows me for me to notice that more often. And then the first thought could be, or the first experience might be frustration towards myself. It's what I really want, like you were talking about this listener. I really want to forgive, in her case. In my case, I really want to fully love everyone and not have any judgmental quality to myself anymore. I really want to let that go. And I notice it's not happening. How frustrating, you know, how irritating. And what happened was, and I think this is just because of the experience of knowing how things actually transform, you know, of practice and of experience, is that once I kind of caught up to what was happening internally in my mind, both towards her, towards myself towards her, is that I thought, oh, right, I really want to have, and again, this is just a straightforward honesty thing, I really want to have those experiences that I've had in the past. I want to have what it feels like to be interacting in the world from my heart. I want to feel what compassion feels like. Now, I've felt wild open-heartedness towards the world. I've felt deep compassion towards myself, towards others, and tenderness many other times. So what wound up happening in this instance, I don't know if it would be different some other time, was like, okay, good. Mental note. I'm going to go home and practice, which means sitting in silence, and sit in my heart and just reacquaint myself with that experience. So it has nothing to do with like fixing the scenario that happened or forcing myself to behave in a certain way. It was really just go directly for the experience that you know is the antidote to this. Almost just like dousing myself in it or something, just like bathing in it. Marinating is the word I'm looking for. Just marinating in that feeling, because it will expand. If I sit in experience more, it will expand and move through my system more easily, and then that will translate to life ultimately. And I know it will, because I'm a really different person. I hope anyone listening can look back, like take a little time with the rearview mirror every once in a while. It's embarrassing, but it's relieving, because it's like, is it working? Have I changed? Hell yes.
Yes, if you know what to look for. Sometimes we look and we don't look at the right variables. But I love that, Brooke, because it takes a lot of pressure off, right? Like you don't have to stop judging that person. You don't have to stop judging yourself. You don't have to forgive that person. You don't have to forgive yourself. You just have to be in the space of your open heart and let something else come through. And when we are in the space of our open heart, we are in a different level of consciousness. And so new things can come through. Who knows what new things can come through? You don't have to control that. I mean, a certain bit of that is a matter of the trust that John offered at the beginning. I think you and I are certainly at the point where we trust when I'm with myself, something comes through. I mean, whatever that is, meaning something new, meaning something healing, meaning rest, whatever it is that's meant to come through, but something comes through. So I love that idea of just inviting the experience of what you want to feel. I imagine how unbelievable that can be to just feel forgiveness for no one in particular. Mm-hmm. If you can't forgive the person that you're struggling and hoping that you can forgive.
Forgiveness for the human condition.
Exactly. Yeah. What would it be like just to have mercy? And then the other thing I was thinking of while you were talking, so it's a little bit to the side, I think, of what you were saying, but it got me thinking about judgment because, you know, oftentimes if I'm doing the here's my great advice for so-and-so in my head kind of judgment that you were talking about, it's usually because somewhere my wound had gotten triggered where I don't get to exist around this person as I am, which is not the person's fault. It's really my thing is what I'm talking about. I'm not trying to put anything outside. But so then I go, no, you're bad, not me. No, I'm bad. No, you're bad. And I kind of do this like bouncing back and forth thing, which got me thinking about existence. And, you and I can be a little metaphysical. Experience is something that is experienced, right? Felt, right? It's another way that we can use the word. It can be like energy. Well, on a metaphysical level, sometimes you and I talk about existing, right? Having the right to exist, which means be you. But it means be you, and for us in this really embodied way, right? Like take up space, inhabit your body, show up, let yourself be seen, let your precious heart be a part of this world, right? Be you means not just what you say, not just what you talk about, not just the choices you make. Those are all a part of it. But it's like the very inhabiting of your being in the here and in the now. So when we talk about existence, for example, many people who listen to this show, I know because we're in dialogue with a lot of them, may feel based on their wounds that they don't have the right to exist as they are, right? That their existence is conditional. Mm-hmm. If any of you have ever related to the term codependency as we use it here on the show, that's one prime example of I don't have permission to exist just as I am. There's always a condition on it. Because what if my existence upsets Brooke today? Well, then I can't do it, right? So then there's a condition on it, right? Okay. So then when we become aware of that, that can be quite a painful thing. I don't get to be me. That's so primal to us, isn't it? To empathic people, especially, like, I just want to be me. I want to be me. It's really very sincere, and it's very primal, and it can be very painful when we perceive that we're not able to exist. Now, no amount of intellectual thought that says you have every right to exist changes that.
Yeah.
It never has. And all of us have been in the position, maybe you had a therapist say to you, you have the right to be you. Maybe you heard it in a commercial, do you, or a nice meme on Instagram, or you have a friend, who gave you great advice and you should just be able to say what's on your mind. And yet, until we experience ourselves as existing and as safe and held in that existence, but held in the way John Prendergast got at the beginning quote, like held by life in our existence, we'll never believe it. We will never believe an intellectual idea or concept over our experience. So if I say to you, oh, but you're so lovable, you're the best, you are X, Y, and Z, and I could just list an incredible list. All of you might relate to this who are not good at receiving compliments. Mm-hmm. If that is not your experience of yourself, you will just wipe it away, like swipe left on my compliments, right? Yeah. We all can see it. We can see people do it. We know ourselves do it because my concept that you are lovable is not strong enough to overpower your experience if you believe you're unlovable. And so I guess we should start to talk about what could one do, right? What are we getting at here? Mm-hmm. I'm going to just start with the top line and then we'll keep going. But the top line is you have to do more than read books and talk about your problems. Mm-hmm. And I mean that with love, knowing that I'm a trained psychologist and I work as a life coach and Brooke works as a coach. We're saying this from a place of love. You can't just go to someone and talk about your problems and think that alone will change it. That will give you relief. It'll relieve pressure. It's really sweet. You might feel loved. It does something, but we need a new experience of ourselves, of relationship, of love, and of the world. So talking alone about the things we already know, especially, that's not going to do it. Reading books alone, that's not going to do it. They're all beautiful gateways, right? They're beautiful gateways. There's zero wrong with them, and I use both of them a lot. But then what? Then what are we pointing to? Mm-hmm. Do you want to start, or was that like a pressure-filled sentence?
No. I mean, I have some ideas. I mean, practice, and by practice, I mean, what is it for each individual that gets you into a state change that shifts your nervous system? And so for some people, that is Vipassana meditation. For others, that is doing inquiry type work like Locke Kelly's or Judith Blackstone's work or HeartMath. So there's a myriad of ways, but I think it's important for us to pay attention, and we can only pay attention via what does it feel like. How does the state change for me? What are some ways that my state changes, meaning that the nervous system relaxes, quite frankly? And I don't mean that in a like, Ben and Jerry's on the couch kind of way, although that's fun from time to time, but getting into a different dimension of reality. So where you're experiencing things from just a different perspective. And so it's usually the simple things. That's what meditation is for. What your breath feels like when you're nervously having a conversation with a coworker is different than when you drop into your body and you're like, oh my God, like it just feels so amazing if you're somebody who can connect with that. So we're looking for the state change and practices that give us that state change.
And in experiential, I like that, Brooke, and in experiential learning, which can come in multiple ways. So, for example, what I just said about the compliment, we can be curious. Mm-hmm. How do I receive a compliment? And just pay attention to the experience that arises in the body when someone gives us a compliment. How interesting. Mm-hmm. And then if we have the fluidity with it, maybe we could play with trying to receive it different. That can be experience. Experience can even be like, let me pay attention to what it feels like if I sit down in a social gathering and I don't direct the conversation. Mm-hmm. Right? Let's, in this example, pretend I usually do. And then I say, what happens if I sit back and I'm more quiet? What arises in me? What happens in the world when I do that? And that can be an experience. Mm-hmm. It can be an experience to have something like, let's say you make a mistake and notice the voice of self-criticism rise, but then say, what would it be like if I put my hand on my heart and I took a breath and I said, it's okay? What would that bring up? What would that be like for me? What would it evoke, right? So experiences can be thoughtful, present moment-based experiments. And they can also be meditation. So, I go in and out of regular practice with meditation. And I've gone in and out of thinking whether you need it or not, My current thought, even though I've gone in and out of meditation, what I have always stayed true to was observing and experiencing and experimenting, just the way you and I were talking about, Brooke. But after 3 months of meditating hourly again, and having done that at other periods and then stopping, I think it's really useful. Mm-hmm. And I think I love all sorts of meditations. I love guided meditations. I love like meditations like when we do a DNRS and it's very specific and very pinpoint, like it has an objective. But also sitting in quiet, like the meditation where there is no observer or analyzer or anything in there trying to manipulate a moment, right? Trying to get an experience, but rather what's it like to be the experience, just to be here, the atmosphere, right, as an experience. And so I like that too. And I just want to say that there is no particular right way. That's what the experiencing part is all about. I was just telling this story to someone the other day. I can't remember who. But when we were with Tammy Simon all those years ago at Meditating with the Body, she was saying how she had kind of encouraged Reggie Ray to create this program.
Right.
So she was the one to say, hey, Reggie, I think, we should turn this into a program with his style of meditation. He said, okay, but, it won't work the same way because everybody needs their own path, right? The teacher needs to work with each person individually because the path looks different for everybody. And of course, as Tammy noticed, there's still something to be gained by putting all of this out there in a more generalized way. But the whole point of experience, of needing experience and being in it and allowing this unfolding and play and experimentation is because no one's path looks the same. Mm-hmm. There is no clear path. Not what we say, not what anyone says, not what Adyashanti or Matt Kahn or anyone says. And that's why at the end, it's always about finding that inner guru. And what is it that we're needing? What's our way through? So there is no real right way. I just want to make sure to say. And I play a lot. Like, I really think a shift in consciousness is required. A shift in the nervous system, like you said, Brooke, it's clear. A shift in the nervous system invites a shift in perspective. Mm-hmm. And we need a new perspective to meet those knotty, long-term chronic issues that feel so real to us. We need a new perspective to meet them. So sometimes I'll do like a really short guided meditation that just kind of opens me up in a new way and shifts my brain state and shifts my nervous system. And then I'll sit there quietly for 20 minutes. Sometimes I'll do something completely guided. Sometimes I'll just sit quietly the whole time. Right? And it's a matter of the whole point of talking about experience is that you get to experiment and then see. And you see to mean like see is what's happening in this moment, but also how does this unfold in my life? Am I more aware? Am I more present? Is the scavenger hunt on? Am I seeing more? Am I being invited to heal at a more accelerated pace? Like, gosh, I wish this could all be so clear. I wish I could give like a clearer way to describe it. It's always like.
Well, I think it is clear and hopefully relieving. It's relieving to me that we make our own paths, not in the way that we're like endlessly grasping at and hoarding a million different tools, but more in the scavenger hunt kind of way. I remember I was talking with somebody the other day and she said she was watching a Charles Eisenstein video and he said this one phrase that just completely is shifting things for her. And I'm like, wow, that's so powerful. And the phrase is, I know how to grow. And
yeah, like what if you held that to be true?
Yeah. And it just, right? The scavenger hunt was on. The scavenger hunt delivered her that video, delivered her that phrase. It landed in her system at just the right time. That is an integral part of her path because when she heard that phrase, I know how to grow, there was this profound shift and a different ability to experience something different. It removed certain kind of veil, For me, one that always comes back and just in terms of inquiry is like Locke Kelly's, you pointed to it earlier, but like what is here right now if there isn't a problem to solve? Always puts me right in experience. It's so profound. But that we can allow the right resources at the right time to find us and that we can feel our way along instead of, the good people move to a Zen monastery and do that for 15 years before they whatever. If you're called to be in a Zen monastery for 15 years, that's for you. Like if that is it, if your being is like, yes, and everything in the scavenger hunt says this, then that. But the whole point here isn't that we follow the rules, it's that we discover for ourselves. Like it's about deepening an intimate relationship with the self. And so a part of that is that we get to like follow the breadcrumbs that are just for us.
Yeah, I know it's so silly. It's like so cliche where it's like not about thinking human. It's not about doing human. Mm-hmm. It's about being. right? And everyone talks about that. It's just, my God, it's funny. We should even have to talk about, be instead of do. It seems like a hilarious joke on human nature that's gotten so convoluted that we have to recognize we're not the analysis, and that we're not a problem to solve, and we're not a puzzle to figure out. We're not a goal to achieve, and we're not an object. We're this magical, mysterious, majestic, subjective reality to meet, to cherish, to play with, to get to know. And it's just so amazing that that we have to find our way back there.
Yeah. And we're doing it within a culture that does the opposite, right? An ego-based, object-based culture, right? So of course it's foreign and unfamiliar and not something we see demonstrated that much. And this probably takes us a different avenue for a different episode, but I personally think part of it is we lose contact with the self and we find our way back to our innate wholeness and our innate being as part of the fun. I think it's just so that we can have that experience of coming back home, period. And that sounds like, okay, but that's really profound, that life delights in our ability to discover ourselves because we are life. This is what we get to do here. And so yes, we're doing it from within the confines of a culture that doesn't give us much to see or move towards that's different than that. I mean, we can't even tell what side is up when we're in a culture like that. But the good news is emerging out of that is ooh, it's like finding land when you've been adrift at sea for a long time. It's a pretty good feeling.
Well, I happen to agree with you. And I suppose if we were to trust Charles Eisenstein's, did I say his name right?
I think so.
Eisenstein's? Yeah. If we were to trust Charles Eisenstein's line, I know how to grow. If we trusted that, it would be so much more relieving, right? Because it's you're going to find your way home. It just takes attention and awareness. And if not now, tomorrow. And if not tomorrow, your next life. It's going to unfold. And I imagine one of the things, just bringing it back home, that's coming to me is John Prendergast's quote in the beginning. There is a field of support. There is a field of support that you can experience for yourself. You don't have to just take our word for it. Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for listening to today's show. The show notes, including resources we mention, are at blissandgrit.com. Our member platform is at patreon.com/blissandgrit. This is where you can go donate to the show and also get rewards for your support. If you're wanting to engage with these topics in a deeper way, if you have questions for us, this is a great place to go for a more immersive experience. You can also come play with us on Instagram and Facebook, or subscribe on the website, which is blissandgrit.com, if you want to get a weekly digest of what resources we're currently loving. We are so very grateful for the reviews you've written, for the membership support you've provided, and all the notes you send. We love to hear from you. We love your support, and we love to feel you. Thank you all so much. Till next week.